Ronald Reagan, the former president of the United States, has been considered one of the most gifted communicators and spokesmen in American politics. In fact, most of the communication coaches that I've associated with and read works from consider Reagan to be the most effective public speaker out of all the presidents to hold office in the United States. And I've been doing some research, particularly this morning, on Reagan's unique communication style, how he thinks through his ideas, reading into the speechwriting team behind him, the techniques that he used to keep track of all of his thoughts. And I want to share a few insights in this brief video that can help anyone improve their communication, but also give us a more profound respect for the sheer amount of effort that Reagan put into the persona and the powerful messages that anyone who was alive during his time was honored to be able to hear. I want to start by reading a quote from Reagan. In fact, this is from his farewell address when he was exiting office. I can't remember the exact year, but I'll link the speech down below. And he even said himself, and I quote from Reagan, "I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things. It wasn't about my word choice. It was about the message and the convictions and the ideals that I believed in." That really struck a chord with me for several reasons. Number one, it made me realize that it isn't so much focusing on the perfection of your words and assembling the most effective composition of words into a sentence to communicate your ideas. When you profoundly believe in something and when you care about what you speak, that passion will almost automatically help you formulate your words into understandable sentences that may not be perfect, but help to communicate the idea. It's almost as if you are intentionally sacrificing perfection in order to characterize and flavor your sentences with passion and something you genuinely care about. And this is often a technique that I've heard described as the two of the three M's, the three M's being me, message, and messenger. Me is where you focus on yourself, and that is where most amateur speakers start. Message is where you realize that the particular combination of your words are important and that words do matter and hold weight in whether or not people are receptive to your message. And messenger is the final stage, the peak status of a masterful communicator, where you realize that it's not just about the words, it's about speaking on things you care about. And in reading some of the articles written by the speechwriting team that worked with Reagan, I found it to no surprise that a lot of what he communicated were the same messages. They were simple messages, but they were messages that resonated with the average person. And this is the second aspect of Reagan's communication that I found very profound. In fact, I want to read a quote here from one of the articles written by, I can't remember her name, I just copied the quote. This was by Reagan's number one or lead speechwriter. She said, "Reagan emphasized that it was not just my rhetoric or delivery that carried him into the White House, but that his speeches contained basic truths like the necessity of preserving individual freedom that the average American instinctively recognized." She says, she's quoting Reagan, "What I said simply made sense to the guy on the street," he wrote, end quote. Always, Reagan sought to speak to the mind and not merely the impulses of the moment. I really appreciate that. Of course, I say that in retrospect, but I do think it's a characteristic that should be underwriting what most politicians say, and not just politicians, but the average person. There's the entire topic of tragedy-based lawmaking, where something happens and people get carried away by emotions, and understandably so, but that often leads to a rhetoric that is devoid of logic and often motivates people to take actions that, in a clear state of mind, one would usually deem as irrational and not the most appropriate action. And Reagan seemed to be very level-headed. Of course, he was one notably who wasn't afraid to demonstrate his emotions. In fact, I believe when the Challenger rocket blew up, Reagan showed the emotional side of himself on camera, and that was something that people really resonated with. And I think Reagan, very masterfully so, realized that if he could connect with the average person and show himself to believe in the ideals that the average person had a shared understanding with, and show himself to be a normal person, as obvious as that often sounds, he really took it to heart. And I think that's why, poll-wise, he was the most beloved president based on outstanding percentage of the American population. And he learned a lot of these techniques from the short career that he had as a spokesperson for General Motors. He would speak to factory workers, and on his long train rides, he learned to think from their perspective and speak to the average person and speak with truth, speak with honesty and authenticity, believing in the causes that they would want to see brought to fruition. Also, one of the secrets of Ronald Reagan that was sort of posthumously discovered after his passing, people knew of, or his speechwriting team would often hint at this tactic that he used, but the public largely became aware of it, and I became aware of it when articles started to surface, when journalists were looking in the archives, the boxes of the contents of the Reagan's presidential desk, and they found hundreds of 4x7 index cards of jokes, proverbs, quotes, economic statistics, anecdotes that Reagan would keep track of. And he would have these categories for different topics. He would have a card on communism, and all of his thoughts on communism were written on that card. He would have a card on, try to think of some of the other topics that were in the article. He would have jokes. He would have different categories that allowed him to basically mind dump all of his thoughts in a very concise way, and then he would have material for any occasion. When he spoke to Kiwanis clubs, or he would speak to factory workers, he had this mental bank of knowledge that he was able to pull from. And his writing team would often talk about, they would give him a draft of their speech that they were writing for a particular occasion in which Reagan was going to deliver the text. And he would ditch the entire text and just pull out one of his index cards, and he would find different ways to rearrange the stories on the cards. He was very quick on his feet in that way. And this is something that he actually learned later on in life. I believe he went into politics when he was 41 years old after doing some speaking tours for General Motors for a while. And this is something that he picked up, as I mentioned earlier, on his train rides. He would spend time categorizing his thoughts, and he realized that a lot of these were ideas that he could repeat. And he often considered himself to have a very short attention span. Or there was one speech that I was watching on YouTube where he admitted that his memory wasn't the best. And as someone who has a similar short-term memory, I actually have been using this tactic for the better half of the last 2 years. I call it my communication keys. It's not index cards as Reagan practiced using. It's instead a Google document that simply has categories of my thoughts on different issues. And it's allowed me to formulate what often in a raw conversation might take me 5 sentences to articulate, I can say in 1 sentence, and it allows me to be more precise and orderly with my thoughts. And it also seemed to be something that Ronald Reagan practiced. And again, he would pull out these index cards, and you can see him in some of his speeches. They were just handwritten notes that he had. Shorthand, he would abbreviate a lot of his words, and a lot of it was illegible by the average person. But when journalists started to go through these boxes, they found these index cards, and it really showed a snapshot. It gave a snapshot of the mind of Reagan, and I found that really fascinating. This is also a practice that I know Martin Luther King Jr. had kept. He had a diary of different poetic phrases, vivid imagery, and quotes, song lyrics that he would want to use in future orations. John F. Kennedy also had something similar. Winston Churchill, I know, was very well known for keeping a diary of any kind of prose, poetry, anaphora, figurative speech, rhetorical devices that he could use in his presentations. And one last thought that I have on watching Reagan's speeches is whether this stemmed from his ability as an actor to pull off a persona of genuine care and authenticity. He did seem to speak with a lot of weight, I think is the best way I would describe it. He seemed to be very careful and calculated with his words. And a lot of people bought into the whole grandfatherly character that tended to be exuded from Ronald Reagan and the presence that he had. And this became a bit more obvious to the American public, especially at the end of his second term. But it certainly did work to his advantage. And there's this infamous line where he was debating one of his younger opponents, and when he was asked about his age, the Ronald Reagan's age, he said something like, "I will not exploit my opponent's age for political purposes," something like that. He ended up turning the question, intentionally misinterpreting it on his opponent, and allowed him to get a joke in there. And that joke was one of one of his index cards has that exact joke written on it. And it's amazing to think that a lot of these spontaneous moments that we often ascribe to him having an incredible wit, of course, do prove that he was very prepared, but also show that he was a master at, I think he already said this, but preparing for these trigger moments, these scenarios that could act as a cue for him to present ideas that he had already organized his thoughts on or prepared a joke for. I just found that simply amazing, and it's something that I strive to integrate into my own communication, and I thought I would share that with you. Thanks for watching.